Welcome to London Lights. I'm here again with our second go-round with Nick Panaseiko, the legendary music promoter from London, Ontario. Nick, welcome to the program. It's good to have you back.
Well, we must have made an impression the first time around. Otherwise, thank you for the invitation back.
One of the reasons why we're having you back, Nick, is because somebody has written a book about you. The name of the book is Backstage Tales from the Vinyl Jungle by Bob Clanick. Photos by John Rowland, the legendary photographer that we had on the show as well. And now we can read about your exciting adventures as well as watch you on London Lights. So yeah, welcome to the program.
Actually, the full title is Promo Man, and it's back to Backstage Tales of the Vinyl Jungle, which deals with my great 70s years with Quality Records, Atlantic Records, every major label in North America, I guess.
I'm telling you, just looking at the cover and the photographs on the cover, I think we could spend our whole program just talking about each of the photographs and each of the huge stars that you worked with as a promoter.
Well, that's what everybody says worked with. It was a job. It wasn't a groupie hangout or chasing your favorite act. It was what came down the pipeline needed to be promoted, and that's what we did.
And not only that, Nick, you did it very well.
Well, if you don't, they move you on. It's like radio DJs. You're here today, gone tomorrow if you're not kidding the audience.
Yeah, so for many years you were working hard at it. And we talked in the first show about some of your rules of success. Always make sure the band got paid first.
That's right. And leading a dual lifestyle for me was a little harder because I was trying to run a house and a wife and a 2-year-old son in London and living in Toronto Monday to Thursday with a sales manager that wanted me in on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock. So I'd be pulling out of London at about 6 in the morning during the winter, sticking my head out the window as the snow was melting down.
Well, that's, you sent me an advanced copy of the book and I really enjoyed reading it, in part because we get these background stories. We get to hear about your family life, your parents, and your hardworking family background. What I really liked about the book as well, where you talked about some of the description of London downtown and what it was like in the 1960s. And I was really tickled by that. You talked about one of my favorite record stores, Bluebird Records on Dundas Street near Wellington. You talked about CHLO radio and all the cool music that was coming out of St. Thomas in those days. And, London, England, of course, at that time had the swinging London Carnaby Street scene. Was there anything similar to that happening in London at the time?
Well, we were kind of split up. London was big on the Carnaby scene, which of course involved the Beatles, Dave Clark 5, Paul Revere and the Raiders. And then we started introducing the Toronto sound, which had the R&B flavor with Down to Toronto and the Rogues and George Oliver. And of course, being stuck between Detroit and Toronto and Buffalo, we were able to access a lot of the black artists like Wilson Pickett, and R&B started really coming out strong in London in 64, 65. My first group was David Lee King and the Apostles. They were as good as any other R&B act out there.
Yeah, and you just went from there. You started small, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Of course, my background photograph shows you with the legendary band Kiss, and you were a big part of their early success.
Well, those were the days when new groups like Aerosmith, New York Dolls, and Kiss were coming out of New York and getting a lot of fanfare with teen magazines that became popular at that time. A magazine called Cream out of Detroit. It was a record-breaking magazine. If you got noticed by Cream, you start building a fan base, and that's where Kiss got noticed.
Now, one of the cool things about London too was we had the first covered mall of shopping retail stores in Canada. And you were fortunate enough to work at the disc shop in that mall, and you talk about that in your book. What was that like?
Well, it was fantastic because we had a chance to have weather-controlled meetings. People used to come out to socialize in Wellington Square Mall. Unfortunately, at that time, they had security guards that didn't favor long hair or hippie-looking styles. So we had a drummer, Paul Kersey, that had long hair, and he ended up getting the moniker of being Sally, and it went on to be Sally and the Bluesmen, a recording group. But in the meantime, he was constantly harassed by the security guards.
That touches a nerve with me, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But one of the things you talk about in the book when you're talking about the disc shop is Graham Lear. And Graham is interviewed in the book. And Graham was a recent guest on our program, and we just had a fantastic time together speaking about his history in London and then moving on to drumming for Santana, REO Speedwagon, Gino Vanelli, and Paul Anka. So do you remember Graham Lear from those days in the disc shop?
Yes, I actually gave Graham Lear his first paid gig at a place called the 3Cs, which no longer exists. There's the Colburn Community Center. There's a condo building up there now. It was across the street from Catholic Central. And Graham, of course, got a lot of notoriety because he was 14, 15 years old, playing with guys who were 18 to 22. And when you look at the early pictures of Graham Lear and the playwrights, you can definitely spot a young teenager at 14.
Yeah, we talked about that during the show. It was quite funny, but obviously a tribute to his tremendous talent, and he was being recognized even at the youngest age.
He was one of the ones that came up through the London drum corps that existed for young musicians that wanted to get into music and be part of the kind of military upbringing.
Well, one of the other things I liked about in your book, and people can get a hold of the book and read this for themselves, but you talk about John Ballone's music store. And I remember it was a highlight of my days as a teenager living in East London to catch a bus on Saturday and head downtown. Just some wonderful memories of all the stores down there, you know, Nut and Candyland, maybe hitting a movie, going to London Cafe or something like that, going to the record stores, Bluebird, and that kind of thing. And I remember also wanting to hit the London Public Library, and the security guards were always seemed very suspicious of us and turning their eyes down at us. I'd go to the music store and I'd look for sheet music for a new song that came out on the radio, and the guys would be looking at me like, oh, what's this kid doing in here with his jeans and everything else? Right. I felt very uncomfortable. But then when you go to John Ballone's welcomed musicians with open arms. You know, I came in with my jeans scraggly, didn't have 2 cents to rub together, and they'd say, hey, sit down and try out this guitar or try out that guitar, or play the drums. They were so welcoming, and I've got to think that they were a big factor in a lot of the early musicians developing their trade.
Very much so. I mean, John was the first one that established the pay-as-you-go situation. He would front you the equipment, you would do your gig, and then you'd be there Monday morning as promised to dole out the $10, $15 that against your account, which set you up for your next show. Because a lot of bands, I mean, the first thing that they were looking for, of course, was buying instruments, and then sound systems were needed, but those were a community buy between everybody in the band throwing in some dollars and cents, or if you're lucky, you had a parent that would spring for the cost of sound. Now, we didn't travel with a lot of sound. They're basically the amplifiers and 2-column speakers, and lights came in a lot later in in the progression of the music developing in London.
Yeah, I mean, I think of music production now. A band like U2 will have 13 transport trucks full of gear and lighting and stage. It's just almost like a corporate industry for them. But the times are very much more simple then, and the focus was very much more on the performance and the music, right, Nick?
Well, yes, we traveled in a Volkswagen bus. The big the big dilemma was for the R&B groups because they were starting to use a B3 and two Leslies, and I don't know whether you've ever tried to lift a B3 or not, but we'd have all kinds of support getting the B3 down the stairs to a frat party, but nobody wanted to bring it up the stairs at the end of the night. So we had to entrust the frat party to take care of the equipment until we could move it again.
That's funny. Well, reading through your book, I'm reading about all the acts that you're involved with, Johnny Cash and John Belushi, I should say, when the National Lampoon Travel Show was going on. Chuck Berry, your neighbor was Grant Smith. Carl Perkins was there with Johnny Cash. You got the Rolling Stone involvement, Ricky Nelson, Bill Cosby, Liberace, Decca Records, Wayne Newton, Freddie Mercury from Queen, Blondie, Van Halen. I mean, the list goes on and on, Nick.
And what we wanted to do with this book, it's a fun read. It's for anybody in the industry, they're going to recall the same type of antics that I pulled. But we try to outdo each other, like I say, to promote the deep with Donna Summer on the soundtrack, dressing up in full gear of scuba diving, the tanks, the flippers, the whole works, and going to radio stations and getting the program director to possibly give the cut a spin.
Yeah, and the name of the book, of course, Promo Man, it talks about the backstage. So, of course, the fans are all seeing the outside glimmer and glamour, but you're seeing things in backstage. And I mentioned Bill Cosby and Ricky Nelson, and there was some not so flattering observations about those two individuals. And people can read about that in the book. But hey, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, I want to talk about some of these legends that you worked with and hear some of your stories. I'm sure Londoners will be entertained by this. So we're going to take a break, folks. Viewers, don't go away. We'll be right back with Nick Panaseiko, Promo Man. Okay, welcome back to London Lights. We're here with legendary Promo Man, Nick Panaseiko. Nick, welcome back to the program. You're excited, I'm sure, about your new book coming out, which recounts your life story and your work with all of these musical legends, some good, some not so good. I want to talk about first the story about musical acts starting to come to the Ice House, the London Gardens, as it was called at the time. And of course, there was a famous incident that happened there when Johnny Cash played with June Carter and proposed to her on stage in London, Ontario. Were you there that night?
I delivered some money from the ticket sales and had the opportunity. It was a late afternoon to hang out with Johnny and Carl Perkins. They happened to have a young photographer taking pictures of them. And of course, I got into the shots. One of the great shots was them lifting me up like a surfboard and joking around with me. But unfortunately, the young kid belonged to the camera club at the YMCA and had the negs developed, but unfortunately in the morning the negs were gone for some reason, and so history in the making disappeared. But of course, Johnny did propose to June that night, and unfortunately, in the movies that are portrayed with Johnny's proposal, the Ice House looks like the Grand Theater. The two different looks of the place. The Ice House was a stark ice arena as opposed to a Grand Theater look.
Well, that's showbiz, right, Nick? I mean, Of course, they want to make a movie, they're going to make it look all glitzy and glamour. But the reality was it was in the cold London gardens and, people sitting on their folding chairs and that kind of thing. But that's the true story. And we're glad that you were here to tell us about it. Now, Nick, I want to talk about, you mentioned photographers, and we know the great John Rowlands. He's been on this program, legendary rock photographer. Like you, he's worked with all of the greats, it seems. How did you and him first hook up?
Well, John and I hooked up when I got my first job at Quality Records in '75, and we became instant friends. The great thing about John was that he would take the pictures, and overnight he was running a darkroom out of his bathroom in a high-rise apartment. He would deliver the contact sheets to us in the morning. We'd pick out the shots, and then he'd deliver the prints, which I would take to RPM magazine and hopefully score some press coverage.
Interesting.
So we've remained friends now for, I believe it's over 40 years.
Yeah, John's a great guy, and he's been very generous with use of some of his photos for this program, and we're grateful for that.
Well, likewise, his pictures, he dominates all the pictures in the Promo Man book, which is fantastic. And the great thing about John was I lucked out in having a press photographer almost at any event that I went to, and it still continues to this day.
Yeah.
We've had the opportunity to have pictures taken with some of the up and coming artists in London.
Yeah, one of the great things about growing up in London too, if you're a young kid and you can't get into the clubs, the Western Fair for many years would bring in some of the biggest acts. And I understand that you were involved with some of those. You brought in Wayne Newton, who probably some people might have a chuckle about, but he was a big deal at one time.
Oh, he was the crooner of crooners at that time. I mean, to have a hit like Donka Shane or Red Roses for a Blue Lady and whatever. Yes, I had the opportunity to interview him. What happened was when I came back from Decca Records in '67, I got a job at the Metropolitan stores to be the record buyer, and I convinced them to title sponsorship Wayne Newton at the Western Fair. So he was good enough to do my early interview that ended up airing on CFPL radio.
Now, you also worked with Freddie Mercury of Queen, and you became friends, didn't you?
Well, the Freddie Mercury came about kind of an obscure situation with the release of their album called Jazz, which really didn't make a lot of sense for a Queen album. But when you open up the sleeve, it focused on Fat Bottom Girls, which was the first single. So I ended up hiring a couple strippers from the Zanzibar.
Hey, keep this clean.
Put them on bicycles outside December
Hey, Nick, we got a family show going on here, so hang tight on that thought. Hey, listen, Blondie you worked with, Jose Feliciano, he was huge, featured, one of his songs was featured in a recent Quentin Tarantino movie. Tell us about those types of folks. I mean, what's it like rubbing shoulders with rock royalty?
Well, I'll tell you, you don't consider them rock royalty because in the industry, it's a team effort. So you're the band, I'm the promo man, there's the music director, there's the DJ. It all comes together in a group of us that are heading for one thing, put the spotlight on the act.
Yeah.
And so, you don't consider yourself a groupie or rubbing your shoulders with anybody. They're just, they're another working cog in the wheel.
Now, we get to hear about some of your family background in the book. And would you credit that with giving you some of the values that helped you become so successful?
Well, the values that it gave me was the opportunity to learn the English language. I arrived here at 5 years old, not knowing anything but maybe the word Coke for a bottle of Coke. And I remember getting my first Macintosh Apple, so Those are two words that I picked up on. But yeah, of course, my family had to dig in. They came here with two suitcases and had to dig in fact, follow seasonal work, picking everything from peaches to apples in some places just to get us through the first winter and the first 2 years that we were here.
Yeah, times were tough back then, and the key to surviving was hard work. Same with my grandparents when they came from
Yeah.
Scotland.
Well,
Um,
I think the immigration helped Canada a lot. I mean, we brought people over that were ready to do work.
when I read a book, your book, there was the National Lampoon Travel Show that you talk about, and Bill Murray is mentioned as part of that group, and Harold Ramis of Ghostbusters fame, Gilda Radner, and of course the wild and crazy man John Belushi.
Right.
And Belushi is basically living as fast as you can in the fast lane. He's using coke and that kind of thing, and he invites you up to his room at the London Hotel, doesn't he? Hotel London.
Hotel London, we go up to the room. I go into the room, we sit down, it's 2 in the afternoon, and I notice something kind of strange about the room, even though the lights are on. It just doesn't seem like the room's normal. And I go over to the double windows overlooking Wellington Street, and here he's got a black pool liner that he's put up with masking tape and gaffer tape to block out the sunshine. So the room's black totally all the time.
Yeah, and you were witness to some drug abuse. I understand.
Well, we the odd time a promo man got to participate, but usually you had to stay straight because you had to sign off at the end of the day.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because, of course, you are in the fast life with all of these bands, and John Belushi's drug abuse eventually did him in. I think you said in the book within a year or so after you were there with him, it took him down. And he's not the only big star who went into the fast lane and was going too fast and crashed and burned. What do you attribute to the fact that that didn't happen to you? You're a survivor.
Well, like I say, we played different roles. My role was to make sure that the press conference went off like it should. My job involved making sure that the limo was there on time. My job involved getting them to the airport if that's what was needed. So it was a meet and greet situation, and obviously you had to be straight to conduct all that because you're dealing with professionals in the industry, everything from record buyers for Sam the Record Man, A&A, to the music directors like Warren Cosford at Chum or Dave Charles at Q107. So it's a different situation when you're putting the package together. It's like putting a birthday party together. You don't get smashed before the party.
Okay, so how did the book come together? What motivated you to do this? It was someone else encouraging you to do this. I mean, I'm so glad you've done it to record these stories for us to read. But what brought the whole thing about?
Well, after my induction into the London Music Hall of Fame, which at that time was called the Jack Richardson Music Hall of Fame, I started putting my thoughts together and ended up stumbling on Bob Clanick, who we had some conversations, and he offered to do the research if I was supplying with the background material, which we did. And plus I took an interest into putting a spotlight on some of the London bands, especially the female singers in London that were finally getting exposure as singers as opposed to eye candy or props on stage. One of the great singers that I really took an interest in was Megan Schroeder, and Megan has done a tribute to, well, the tribute of music to Patsy Cline and Stevie Nicks, and also as a feature singer of a rock band called Loveless.
So yeah, it was a male-dominated industry for the most part before. The women were eye candy, but they started to come into their own, and you enjoyed promoting them. Worked with the Supremes and other bands, correct?
Well, the Supremes unfortunately came in to fill in a gap of a canceled Gene Pitney show, so that's kind of a break in some ways because they're just up and comers out of Detroit.
Yeah. Well, Nick, listen, this is the second time on the program. I found this interview just as interesting as the one in season one. The book is coming out. I would urge everyone to consider reading it and getting a copy of it. I expect it'll be available at bookstores, the London Music Hall of Fame, and also at the London Public Library. Nick, thank you again for being here. You've left quite a mark on the music industry and helped cement London and its reputation as a music center. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking the time to build a series of shows that are doing exactly that, spotlighting the great talent in London and remembering the past, which is going to hang in with us as long as we're all still here.
Right. Well, thanks again. And thanks to Bob Clanick for writing the book and John Rowlands for providing the fantastic photographs. Viewers, I hope you enjoyed the interview with Nick Panaseiko, promo man extraordinaire. Nick, stay safe and we'll talk to you again someday.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.